This video is going to go over the vertebrae and the several different types of vertebrae that we see in the body. So we're going to start out with just a general vertebrae. This is a thoracic, but this applies to all of them. So we have several features on the vertebrae. The first one is this vertebral body, and it's going to be this big chunky part that they all stack on top of each other. So, like I said, this is a thoracic, but here's a lumbar, so you can see how that size can vary depending on the vertebrae itself. Now, next to the vertebral body is this big hole. This hole right here is the vertebral foramen or vertebral canal. It's what my finger's through right now. And that hole is where your spinal cord goes through. So as the bodies stack on top of each other, then the holes also stack on top of each other and your spinal cord goes through those, so the vertebrae protects them. The spinous process is this part right here that sticks out. That's going to stick out posteriorly, so towards the back of the body. And if you run your finger down somebody's spine, you'll feel those little bumps. You're feeling those spinous processes. Last feature that's on all vertebrae are going to be these guys right here. These are the transverse processes. So single transverse process and another transverse process. Okay, so the features that are on all of the vertebrae, you've got the vertebral body, the vertebral foramen or vertebral canal, transverse processes, and the spinous process. Now that's going to be regardless of which type of vertebrae it is. Now the first type of vertebrae that we're going to look at is called the cervical vertebrae, and here's a standard cervical vertebrae. Now notice on the cervical vertebrae we actually have two other features, these little holes right here. Those little holes are called transverse foramen, and those are for nerves to come out of the brain and blood vessels to come out of the brain and move into the rest of the body. So we still have our transverse process, our spinous process, our vertebral canal, and our vertebral body. But the cervical vertebrae also have these two holes, so that's going to define a cervical vertebrae. Now the cervical vertebrae are the top 7 vertebrae from the cervical vertebrae number 1 that your skull sits on down to number 7. And those are the vertebrae of your neck primarily. Now there are two specialized vertebrae that are cervical vertebrae, the first and the second, and they're going to sit just like that, and then the skull's going to sit on top of them. So the skull to this first one's called the atlas, and it looks kind of like a ring with two little projections on the side. Now notice it does not have a body, but it has a very, very large vertebral foramen. Still has those transverse foramen. Okay, and it sits on top of the second vertebrae, which is the axis. The axis has this little piece that sticks up that is called the dens. And that's what identifies this as the axis. And the atlas to the axis, that's what lets you actually turn your head. Okay, so you can see that rotation there. And then the skull to the atlas, when the skull sits on top of here, that's what lets the head nod. So between the skull to the atlas and the atlas to the axis, that's what gives us that free range of motion in our skull. So standard cervical vertebrae, it's this guy right here. Then we have our two specialized, the atlas and the axis. And there are 7 of those total, including these two. Now if we move down to our thoracic vertebrae, this is a thoracic vertebrae. So just those standard features, but to identify the thoracic, we've got two different things. One, right here on the sides, you can see we kind of have these little divots, one on the top and one on the bottom. Those divots are called rib facets, and those are where the ribs come around the side from the sternum. They wrap around the side of the body and connect right there. So one rib's going to connect down here and one rib's going to connect down up here. All right. The other thing we can look at is the shape of the spinous process. So you'll notice that it's long and thin, and if we put it in anatomical position here, you'll see that it angles downward. So from the body being straight, it angles down. Long, thin, and pointed down, that's going to be your thoracic. And sometimes if you look at the front of it, let me see if I can get you a good view here. Some people say when they're looking at the front of it, it looks kind of like a giraffe. So there would be the horns for the giraffe, the ears, and the face. So that might be able to help you. Now, the next vertebrae in the row is the lumbar vertebrae. So these are the ones with the very large vertebral body. Same features. Nothing very specific, no specific features on this that identify them perfectly, but you can see the very different shape to that spinous process. So let me pull that thoracic back over. So you can see how the thoracic points down, whereas the lumbar, it's very square and blocky and points straight out. And then if you look face on, some people say it kind of looks like a moose, so that can kind of help as well. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and there are 5 lumbar vertebrae. So 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. Now as we continue down, this is the sacrum or the sacral vertebrae. Now in a child, each of these are separate vertebrae, they're separate pieces, whereas in an adult it fuses together to be the sacrum. So sacral vertebrae fuse to become the sacrum. The very bottom of the sacrum, right here, we have the coccyx or the coccygeal vertebrae. This is our tailbone. So in some individuals, it's fused on and actually connected. In other individuals, it's free-floating, and each of these little vertebrae are just separate pieces of bone connected by cartilage. And that's just individual variation as to whether that's going to be fused together or if it's going to be separate. So in total, we have 5 different types of vertebrae: the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and then the sacral vertebrae and the coccygeal vertebrae, or the sacrum and the coccyx.